Good morning. I have to say that the stories of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, showing his resurrection to an utterly transformed yet totally bodily form of life, strain the very limits of credibility. But there is also a dilemma, because although they strain the limits of credibility, the documentary and witness evidence for them is actually very good indeed. So what am I going to do with this dilemma? How am I going to try and resolve it? Well, it seems to me that the story of the unfairly named doubting Thomas in John chapter 20 can be quite illustrative for my purposes. It is unfair that he's called Doubting Thomas, because there is a lot more to him than that. And whether he is right or wrong to doubt, and whether indeed he's actually condemned by Jesus as much as people have assumed him to be, is very much a moot point. But let's look at what the story is actually saying and what it tells us about Thomas, and what perhaps I can learn, and maybe you too, from this very curious encounter. There is a sort of tendency to smugness on the part of Christians, in my experience, and I've probably been guilty of this myself too, in discussion groups and Bible study and what have you, where we look at how the disciples behave in the Gospels and are inclined to criticize them and say, well, we know better. We believe in Jesus' resurrection without doubting, like Thomas did. We don't make the same mistakes in failing to recognize who Jesus was or what his message was about as his disciples did. But I would want to reflect on that in the following way, that at the very least, these disciples and apostles allowed or even commissioned these rather negative or questionable stories about them to be handed round and recorded in the Gospels. And that, I think, at least shows them to have been people of courage, quite apart from the ways they went on to behave, the great heroism, the great courage they showed, the dedication and love in preaching the gospel, and indeed causing the Gospels at some point to be written. So I'm rather disinclined to be smug and patronizing in my attitude towards any of the disciples, and least of all to the unfairly named Doubting Thomas. Because in the story, he hears from his fellow apostles that Jesus has risen, that they've encountered him and spoken with him, and he's there bodily in the flesh, in reality. And he says, I simply can't believe this. I need to have empirical, though he doesn't use the word empirical, of course, but physical, empirical evidence for this. I need to be able to actually see the wounds and to touch him, and only then will I believe. And you might think, well, fair enough, because even though he presumably found his fellow disciples trustworthy characters, they're friends of his, he would be predisposed to believe them, and therefore their status as witnesses would be a fairly high one. Yet he's being asked to believe something that is utterly incredible. Yes, of course, pious Jews of the time did have an ultimate hope that one day God will raise all the righteous ones in a general resurrection of the dead. But the claim that this had happened to somebody just a few days ago, who, notwithstanding that, had also been crucified as a criminal and shown to be a complete failure, and his movement shown to be a complete failure, and it was all a total disaster, and so on and so forth. To be told that this person had actually now experienced God's glorious resurrection was utterly unbelievable. They would have found it, well, clearly did find it as incredible as many people do today, but for slightly different reasons. They had slightly different worldviews from us, but that didn't mean that they were prepared to believe any old nonsense. And the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead must have appeared to be that kind of claim. And then in the second resurrection appearance in this story from John 20, where Jesus actually appears again and Thomas is with them, the exchange is quite interesting, and I'm going to just read it briefly for you. A week later, John says, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them on this occasion. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now, there's a great deal in this passage, a great deal in the whole reading, and for the purposes of trying to keep this within something like 10 minutes, I'm only going to focus on the one issue of Thomas's incredulity and how Jesus responds. And a few things strike me as being particularly interesting about this exchange. One is that Jesus doesn't really rebuke Thomas. He says, well, don't doubt any longer. Thomas has no intention of doubting because his demand for evidence has been satisfied, but believe. And then Jesus says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. And the word blessed is not so much a commendation. It's not saying you're doing better if you can manage to believe in the resurrection, as all the generations of Christians subsequently have had to do because they haven't had the physical evidence of having encountered the risen Jesus. Being blessed is being in receipt of a gift. It's a passive thing, being blessed by somebody else. And I would say that all those many generations of Christians who have managed to believe in the resurrection are very fortunate. It's not that they're better than Thomas, it's that they are luckier in that they haven't had to wrestle with the demand for this physical evidence. Or so it would seem for those who do manage to believe in the resurrection. The other thing that's interesting about this is the utter transformation in Thomas's attitude. He is so overwhelmed by actually meeting the risen Jesus and having evidence of his resurrection that he proclaims him as my Lord and my God. He is, although in a Jewish context, in a Jewish milieu, he falls before another human being and proclaims him as God. And the radicalness of that transformation in his attitude shouldn't be underestimated. This is somebody who is completely turned around by what he has experienced. So what might I try to learn from this story in which Thomas, I don't want to call doubting Thomas, I want to call him faithful Thomas, the Thomas who proclaims, perhaps the first to proclaim Jesus's full divinity in the Gospels, I think. Well, what can I learn from this? Well, today we live in a world, a society, in which we find it extremely difficult to believe some things. We're naturally suspicious. We're looking for conspiracy theories all over the shop, even completely implausible ones, believing that a government or an institution which has shown itself prone to leaks and a staggering level of incompetence in the way it manages its affairs is somehow capable of concealing from us what is really going on. And very often this is completely implausible. And yet, on the other hand, we show ourselves prepared to believe any old rubbish if it suits our purposes to do so, such that Bill Gates is putting microchips in the vaccines or something like that. I mean, people seriously believe this. And it seems to be quite difficult to work out how we can actually start believing things that are credible and exercising common sense, discernment, and so on and so forth. And I would say that trying to exercise common sense and discernment in something like the proclamation of Jesus's resurrection is something that I've come to the view over many years of reading this stuff and praying about it and all the rest, is that it is actually credible, that the witnesses are pretty sound, that this is an astonishing thing to believe. and yet it is something that could well have happened. And I haven't come to this position easily or lightly, but it is one that I would commend to you if you wish to reflect on these texts and this tradition as well. And once I have come to the position of being able to believe it, there is then the perhaps even more important task of deciding how I'm going to let this belief in the transformative power of resurrection transform my own life for the good. May God bless you all, and I wish you all a blessed and a happy day this Eastertide.